This is Overture, the Prelude Podcast. Welcome to the Prelude Podcast. My name is Christopher Willis, and today we have Alex.
Hey.
And we also have a guest speaker, Robin.
Hey.
So, Robin, want to introduce yourself?
Yep, sure. So my name is Robin Williams. I currently lead a Purple team at a large retail company.
Awesome. So thanks for spending some time with us on the podcast, Robin. So we have invited Robin to the podcast to discuss mainly purple teaming, but I'm sure we'll diverge a bit from the topic as we go along. So purple teaming is still considered a new term in the security industry. I personally remember my first time hearing of the purple team concept back around 2014 when a company I was working with at the university was exploring a new way of doing security assessments. I still believe purple teaming is an evolving concept. So Robin, how would you define purple teaming?
Purple teaming, in general, the way I kind of look at it is as a bridge, not just between offensive and defensive teams or response teams, but as a how do I say it, as a central like axle in the wheel. If we're thinking of kind of where purple team should sit within an organization, it would be the axle in the wheel. Wow. So all these teams, I kind of look at all the teams in an organization as spokes, coming into that, in and out of that central point there, right? And purple team helps to facilitate, in my eyes, not just the technical aspects of testing a particular TTP or an adversary environment, but also helping to bridge knowledge gaps, relationship gaps between teams and an organization, and then getting everybody united under a common vision, a common mission, and getting teams to understand that at the end of the day, we're all on the same team, and we all need to be under that same protect the organization vision, and then work on getting those teams aligned with the response teams, because they play such a critical role in defending the company. A lot of these teams in cybersecurity are just supporting mechanisms of the SOC analyst teams and things like that. So we really have to kind of work towards shoving them in that direction. Like, hey, your roadmaps are awesome and they're great for your products, but ultimately your focus needs to be on supporting what the SOC analysts require to protect the organization at the end of the day.
So were you hired as a purple team lead, or was this position kind of created over time in your organization?
So it's a good question. So I was initially hired to do offensive security for the company I currently work for. And then kind of as a couple of years went by at the company, in any organization, you start to figure out the gaps, either technology or people process and technology gaps, right? So you start to know and understand the business a bit more as well. So what happened is I kind of looked at, our people process and technology gaps and tried to figure out, kind of using like first principles thinking. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that, but narrowing things down to like an ultimate like root, and then start to solve the root issues that are causing those gaps, and work our way up. And that's kind of how Purple Team at the organization that I work for got started. So I kind of recognized, there was a knowledge gap, with SOC analysts understanding how attackers think and how they operate when they get on a system in the environment and things like that. So one of the first things we took a look at was, what's causing them, not to have the knowledge that they need. Is it training? Do we need to put together like an internal training package, get them running through it? Is it just because they can't keep pace? So pace has a lot to do with it, right? You can only consume so much information every day, and if you're just constantly focused on response efforts, or you're waiting for technologies to build out, you don't have time, to go out on your own after hours and things like that. So, so we started putting together what I call knowledge shares, which are just we go out and we started taking a look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and then putting together essentially fairly quick presentations that were really easy to digest, where we present a specific TTP to some degree of depth, not like a minimal amount of depth, but just like right in the middle, not too much either, because we don't want to overwhelm them. But we talk offensively to that TTP, how it's been used. We identify threats that use it and things like that. And we kind of get in technical depth around the offensive side. And then we swing it on them, because at first they weren't expecting it. Now they are. So we would swing it on them and we would talk defensively. So how do we detect this? What does this look like in logs? Those types of things. Here's some general queries, or some detection ideas that you might want to consider and take a look at based upon this TTP, and kind of what we've discovered in our own testing and things like that in our particular environment, what works in our environment. So they really grasped onto those so much. We went from I think it was once a month when we first started out, and then we were doing them bi-weekly. So we're kind of at that crazy cadence of that, but that's kind of how everything got going. And then we had to test the technical side, right? Response processes, things like that. So it was back in December of 2019 where we had our first actual purple team engagement, where we focused on gauging our SOC response processes and things like that. And then from there, it just kind of exploded.
It really sounds like a lot of what you're doing is helping people develop their OODA loop. I know you and I are big believers in the OODA loop, and at least as described from what I'm kind of understanding, a lot of these organizations, sub-organizations within your larger organization don't necessarily understand how what they do ties into the larger organization. And in that vein, like you said with the SOC, they don't really have a complex understanding of the offensive side of the security. So you're helping them kind of complete that OODA loop, the understanding, so they're able to better observe and orient to that particular instance. Is that a fair way to characterize the work you're doing, or would you characterize it a different way?
Yeah. And I would also say, a lot of people tend to get stuck in the loop. I'm sure you guys have seen it, in your experience, but, they get to the point where they have to make a decision, and then they loop right back around to the first orientate. So they never make a decision and go through the whole loop. They just stop there and then start all over, make it back to a point of making a decision. And then it's right back to square one. And a decision is never made about that particular thing. And their loop might start over on something new from there. So my big thing is if organizations want to mature to a level where they can get in front of adversaries, then we need to move at kind of two speeds, and they're almost relatable-ish. We need to, they need to be able to move at the speed of technology being implemented in their environment, and then they also need to move at the speed of threat intelligence. of the threat actors, of the information gathering, process that's out there between those CTI teams, those threat intel teams.
One of the areas that I like to talk a lot about is the operation mindset, and that's really what it boils down to. So for the listeners who have never heard of OODA, that's an operational mindset used in the military where you do observe, orient, decide, act, and you use that loop as a basis for making decisions as circumstances arise. So you orient yourself to the situation, what's going on, you get a baseline understanding. You observe what's happening as a result of that situation unfolding. You make a decision on how you're going to react to that situation, and then you act on that decision. And then you go back to the beginning of your loop and you observe the impact your action had. But applying that thinking to cybersecurity is how you kind of start transitioning away from the compliance side thinking where, you patch. I'm just going to patch this server and I'm done. And you move away into incident response. And how are you going to actually tackle an ongoing threat live in your network?
Yeah, exactly. And I want to say, I think, OODA loop, it definitely, it's definitely beneficial to go through that process, but also, recognize that if you're going to strictly kind of follow that mindset, that OODA loop mindset, and drive your organization through that you need to make sure that your processes and your decision making, and even kind of thought processes even are efficient and quick to move at the speed of which we need to for cybersecurity, right? So I think again, a lot of people, they get hung up and then they come to a point of making a decision and then they start right back over on a new problem.
Well, that's kind of military core tenets, right? You have centralized command and control, decentralized execution, and it's pushing authority down to your essentially equivalent line managers in your organization to make decisions and accept the risk of making those decisions. And really it boils down to, do you have, like you said, inside your company, are your processes to the point where your leadership can accept the risk of someone like you saying, this is what we need to do right now. Sorry, make it real. We have the Log4j stuff going on. We need to take this service offline, for example, because the impact that it could potentially have to our business is larger than the impact of us losing money during that duration of that service being offline. And how do you have a framework for assessing that risk? And then how can you make it make decision points? In the military, we called them pre-approved actions. What is the threshold for a line manager having the authority to say, we're going to do this? And if you look in other industries, I always like to make parallels. If you look in the automotive industry and you look at, I forget the name of the company, but they introduced the concept of the andon cord, where literally anybody on the line, as things are going through production, can pull the andon cord, and that brings the entire line to a stop. And that's in order to improve your processes and improve the quality of the product that you're delivering at the end of the line. But it also prevents people from pushing issues further down the line and saying, whatever, I don't care. Not a problem, not my problem. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in applying that andon cord concept and methodology to cybersecurity and within your organization, and allowing managers to accept risk.
Alex, I thought you were going to go down a completely different path, the Fight Club path, and talk about the risk associated with car crashes and recalls. Car companies do look at recalls and how that will affect an outcome of a crash. And I think that sometimes that's some of the negative, I would consider it negative approaches to a company that's not necessarily cyber aware. Maybe they know a little bit, but they're more concerned about the money coming into the business and not necessarily the money that might end up being lost, and then they can just top it up to insurance and say, hey, this happened. Sometimes they might not even do that. And basically just let it go by the wayside. I think a lot of that happens, and there's a lot of companies that just don't want to own up to it either.
Yeah. So it's definitely embarrassing getting caught with your pants down, right? So yeah, you have a brand to protect. Like every business has a brand, right? So they want to do, most of them want to do everything they can not to admit that something negative has happened on the inside, even if nobody knows about it publicly, right? So there's a scramble to protect the brand. There's a scramble to protect the revenue. There's a scramble to protect, the customers. When it's honestly far easier just to pull a system offline and say, hey, we just protected all three things. We didn't have to, beat around the bush about it. We pulled it down. Our brand is protected, customers, and we took a minor hit, in the scheme of things, of like annual revenue, right? We took a very, very tiny hit, right? And we can work with our, like our third parties or whatnot that an organization might be connected to. We can work with them and explain to them the, situation why we had to pull that particular system offline and why they couldn't, purchase something.
I think you're hitting on a really interesting point here as well. We're going to see, in my opinion, a normalization of cyber responses. Over time, we'll just kind of see things will trend to people accepting certain things as status quo when it comes to how a company responds to a cyber incident, or sorry, I call them cyber incidents, but pretty much anything related to information security. And we already have now, the government is making regulations on companies. They have to report if some kind of leak happens or if data is accessed in a certain way. And what doesn't exist now is the public understanding of this is just the way it is. If something bad happens to a company or if some big exploit comes out and everybody's getting hit. Right now, the larger population has no concept of what that means. And to us, the world is burning down, but to them, things are just whatever. It's all normal, right? And what happens if the internet turns off for 20 minutes one day because there's a seriously bad bug across something that underpins the foundation of all of the technology that we use? Will people just eventually start to understand that that's going to be the way it is? Sorry, sometimes something's that bad and you're just going to lose access to Facebook for 20 minutes, right? I think, in my opinion, we're going to end up going that way. But now we're getting a little far away from the purple team topic here into more grandiose, less fixable topics.
I think part of our mindset really needs to be around, making either inside an organization or even to the greater community, making security as accessible as humanly possible, and then making it even more accessible after we do that. From my experience, what I see is a new security process gets put in place. People ignore it because they don't want to do it. It doesn't get done. Then we have issues during, an incident or something like that, comes up or crops up or something doesn't get patched because it didn't have, what it needed because it didn't go through the process for that. And we should be, as people within cybersecurity, taking a look at those processes and putting them at the front. So a developer wants or needs to spin up a server in the environment and make it, internet facing, right? Well, you need SSL certificates. There's, endpoint hardening that might occur. Endpoint security agents need to be installed, right? And some of that happens automatically. But there's other things that the developer isn't necessarily going to be in tune with. So if we could put something together that ships, every time a new server is spun up, this is the first thing they see. They have to go through this. They can't, spin the server up and make it internet facing until they go through this. And it's, it's like, one idea I've kind of had is when they spin it up and they first log in, that process is already going in front of their face, and it's a question. Do you need an SSL certificate? Yes. Enter the information here. SSL gets created. It gets set up. They don't have to worry about that. But that traffic is now secure. So we just built that layer, for example. User access levels and things like that. So you could start develop, things like that could be right at the forefront of your processes that they have to go through that aren't crazy and complex, that could handle a lot of those things. But I think we kind of do it as an industry. We do it to ourselves, because in a lot of organizations, there's a copious amount of red tape for everything. I mean, it's just everywhere.
Yeah, you actually reminded me of an article that I read that I was just trying to pull up. I can't find it. So Netflix introduced this concept that they call the security paved road. And they're trying to get exactly at the problem you are describing. And what they provided to developers over the course of several years in developing this concept is a way for them to essentially, from design, offload a lot of the security responsibilities to a centralized security stack. So that included their all of their authorization is basically handled. They don't have to worry about it as a developer. They just import the library for authorization across Netflix applications, and it's done for them. Same for web application firewalls. It's basically just offloaded and handled. Same for a lot of the provisioning and standard DevSecOps type stuff. And as a result of that, I think, I don't have the exact numbers in my brain, but from what I can recall, I think the lead time for getting an application into production went from several weeks to 24 hours. They could have a brand new service online in production, providing services to customers in less than 24 hours, and it was secure by design. So I think that's a very poignant point you're bringing up, and it's also something we're going to see a lot more of. And there's already great examples out there on the internet of companies doing this that we can kind of take and adapt and utilize in our own way.
I don't know if you guys have really kind of looked into like Netflix at all as a company, right? But the reason that works is because of Netflix's culture. And what I was about to say before you kind of tied that in was because of all that red tape. In a lot of organizations, we lack a lot of innovation. So red tape is stifling innovation now in cybersecurity in a lot of levels. So we have to clear away the red tape first, and we have to get people comfortable with the idea of innovation, right? And then we look at things like that. So Netflix in particular has a really amazing culture that's innovation driven, where the vision is very clear. There's no red tape unless it relates to things like, compliance, sec filings and things like that, right? So they can bring in top tier people, like top 1% in industry. They bring them in, high dollar value, right? And then they say, essentially, innovate. And these people get to work because they're, the top 1% in industry, and they get to work innovating. And then you have things like the processes you were talking about in regards to how they do, security there. We need more of that. It's terribly difficult to get around a lot of the red tape, and there, of course, there's business risk and there's concerns, but there's business risk when you spin up a new service. There's business risk when you log into your Windows machine every morning. There's a risk, and it's just about clearing away that red tape and allowing for innovation. So these organizations really need to take a look inward and be like, okay, do I trust my people to innovate? Do I trust them to lead us to kind of like a path to victory in cybersecurity, and to keep the company secure? And am I comfortable with not only the risk, but holding those people accountable if it fails, right? Because you don't want people innovating a whole bunch of broken stuff. You want the innovation to actually be innovation.
To bring us all the way back to purple teaming, because it's supposed to be notionally what we're talking about, right? Do you see that as a large component of your role as the purple teamer in your organization, building that foundation of trust across the management stack and the technical team?
Absolutely. I think the way that I look at purple team is different. There's some similarities, and we definitely do things a lot differently, I would say. A lot of organizations are kind of looking at purple team as just being this like one-off, like cadenced type of process. And then it's just kind of like, we'll get the intel, we'll build an assessment, and we execute, we'll work with the blue team. And then like we're done until the next assessment, right? And then everybody get back together. So I don't think that's the correct way. I think that's a good start, but I don't ultimately believe that like that's the path that should remain, going forward. We should take a look at, purple team is its own team, and it's a team, and its mission is to bring all these teams under the single kind of mission or vision of protecting and securing the company, and getting all these other teams who might not have the depth of understanding offensively or defensively in line to where their focuses should be, and bringing those teams together. So like while we do, various different tests and assessments and things like that, I also do like a lot of relationship building. So it's like critical because this is new for a lot of companies, purple teaming wise. So you need that buy-in. So I try to kind of like run things that we're doing like we're essentially a startup inside of a company. And I think that approach has been very, very good for us specifically, but I think it would work in different organizations too, because that like startup mindset, that grinding it out, that having to innovate, because we have to develop new processes, we have to develop different methods and avenues of testing. We have to be able to understand and have processes around like different technologies in the environment. We have to kind of figure out how we accurately gauge, what's being implemented in our environment and things like that. So, and fortunately, currently, it's a lot less red tape for us these days, which is nice, right? It allows, again, for that innovation. And that's what we've been able to do. We've been able to innovate processes and things like that, and really drive our program to be a singular team whose goal is to unite all the other teams, right? So,
yeah, I have a really, I forget the exact word I would use here, but vulgar, I guess, question to ask you. What would your response to a purple team is just what a red/blue team should be? What's your answer to that?
Should be. What kind of question is that? Maybe I'm a little confused. Maybe a little more.
It's a hot take, right? I guess
it's a hot take.
It's a hot take.
Purple team. No, so purple team is gosh. They should be. Gosh. Oh man, this is a tough one. So this is a good question because like now I'm thinking about it, I'm like,
I think you brought up a pretty good point at the beginning where you talked a lot about the people aspect, and I think that's like a super important part of the purple team that can bring that to that is where you have offensive capabilities and that side. You also know the blue side and the defensive aspects, but you're also bringing in that organizational knowledge and the people aspect that really brings everything together. And so it ends up being a much better process like throughout. You still need your SOC analyst and your defensive teams, and purple team isn't going to just be your end all be all. But really your purple team ends up being the synergy that gets everything together, right?
And it's kind of interesting because I think what I see a lot of organizations and where that question kind of stems from is, are you familiar with the PBED planning process? Plan, brief, execute, debrief. So that's a concept the Air Force uses for tactical planning and tactical execution on mission, right? And a lot of organizations, at least as I've seen in their application of red versus blue type stuff, they only really do the E part with a little bit of the D. Wow, phrasing on that. A little bit of the debrief. We will use.
Can we keep that?
Yes, we will 100% keep that because that's hilarious. So a lot of them will go through the execute debrief component, and the debrief is usually just a piece of paper that has an output of, here are the vulnerabilities we found, here's what we got access to. And if you look at a military actual red versus blue exercise, the whole point of that is you have before you get into the execution component, you have a planning phase where you're talking about, from the red side, your training objectives as a red team, what you're trying to accomplish, what the blue team has as their training objectives, and what you're going to do to help the blue team meet their training objectives. Then you go into a briefing where you're briefing to your leadership, here's what the red team is going to do in order to meet their training objectives, and here's what they're going to do to help the blue team meet their training objectives, and here's what blue team is trying to accomplish. And then you actually execute it, and at the end, everybody comes into a room together, and you do what's called a shot validation process. The red team will say, we did this. Blue team, did you see this? No, we did not. Okay. Go on to the next item on the list that they did during their exercise. But it's a very collaborative experience in the military, and I have not seen that in the commercial sector. And I think they use, a lot of times, commercial sector uses the verbiage of red versus blue, but they don't actually implement the core philosophies of what a military exercise should be and what a red versus blue should be. At least that's my experience. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
No, I would say that's definitely true. That's definitely what I've seen too. Yeah, that's important. Like, I guess it depends. I guess it depends though, right? Because, and I'll just, it depends, like everything else, right? It should be as collaborative as humanly possible, for most things, right? But I think you start to get driven by, depending on what you're testing too, right? So you have to take a look at, are we going to be focused on like our response process during this test? Are we going to be focused on like our analysts, like knowledge base? Are we going to be focusing on like our technology? So I took all that, I took all that complexity of like, what are the red team objectives, and what are the blue team objectives? And I just said, okay, it doesn't matter because they'll typically fall under the people, process, and technology areas. And if we can cover those every single time we run like a full scale engagement, for example, if we can cover all three of those, then we're meeting everybody's objectives. And our focus should be primarily on the blue team anyways, when we're doing a lot of our testing, right? So that's kind of how like I handled like that whole thing, because like red team might have their own objectives as far as like, well, we want to test out this cool like EDR bypass thing. And then blue team is like, well, our objective doesn't really align with like detecting some unknown new technique. It aligns with ransomware, right? So like, how are you supposed to build an engagement and have it be good between both the teams, and still kind of like accomplish all of those objectives? How many pieces of ransomware do you see using like unknown EDR bypasses?
Yeah, that's a great question. Shameless plug for myself. I'm actually writing a blog series on exactly how to do that. So one of the core premises of the whole planning phase of the PBED cycle is, before you go into your tactical level planning, you're doing this process in like operational speak that's kind of called like strat to task, strategy to task. So you're taking your higher level business organization goals, and you're breaking them down into operational objectives and then tactical objectives. And the goal there is that over the course of, let's say you're going to do a week-long engagement, you're going to start with red team doing certain actions to meet their objectives, and they're going to have their higher level objectives as you described. And as you progress through the week, the red team cranks up difficulty while the blue team attempts to detect, and you find that threshold where they're no longer able to detect, right? No longer able to detect and respond to that kind of situation. And that's where you know where your threshold is. And that gives you a good measure of effectiveness. Like, how effective is your blue team at detecting varying levels of complexity across a whole stretch of techniques that you're trying to test, and where do you just lose visibility? And that gives you a higher level across your organization measurement that you can apply for your next engagement, and looking at how effective are we relative to our previous engagement where we lost visibility on X day, where they did X level of technique and we could not detect it, but now we are able to detect this and we've gotten a little bit better, and red team can still meet their objectives in that case. That's a model that at least I've used in the past that I found fairly successful.
Oh, it actually works. I was going to ask that. Kind of a smart question there, I guess. Like, that actually works, results wise. I guess I could see how it works, right? There's kind of red team operational TTP improvement. Right now, they know that they probably can't use that anymore, or they could use specific things, during red team operations to get around defensive controls, because now they already have a specific measurement that they already have seen. They already know blue team can't detect this, so we'll just execute this every single time, and that tends not to do anybody any good. Obviously, so blue team can't detect it, right? So ultimate goal is to drive blue team to detect and respond, right? So I think if something hits that threshold, anything after that, red team wise, it's the only person it's valuable for is the red team. Well, red teamers typically, from my experience, in my experience being a red teamer, they tend to be more technically savvy anyways. So once you reach that threshold of okay, we no longer can see any of this stuff, it's a good to know, but it doesn't really benefit any, there's no immediate benefit, I should say, right? There's a lot of scrambling to figure out, okay, well, what's the impact of this? How do we detect this? And I think those things are important, but I think a lot of organizations will find they're not even ready for the basic stuff in their environment, right?
We've had so much talk on that. For me, I always like creating super complex adversary chains, and it's just way too much, right? And so so many companies are not even ready for the basics, and it's really, really interesting to for me to know that, right? I'm always thinking what's the craziest thing I could do right now? But a lot of times not even I mean, of course, I think of the small business not really being able to gather all the complexity that you would have in, say, a complex adversary chain, for instance. But even the your big organizations, your Fortune 500s, they have a hard time with just complex or something that's the unknown.
Yeah. And then I think really at that point, that's where you start to bring in threat intelligence into the process, right? And you say, what are the threats that our organizations face? And then you start to, you score them out, or however you do it, and you determine kind of who and what is a priority threat to your organization. And then you base a lot of your purple team efforts around those high priority threats, right? And then you get through those, and from there, once you've taken care of those high priority threats, you can choose to go through those medium and lows, but really the focus should be around critical and high, right? And then then you become intel driven and you start keeping up with like intel, the process, because the threats change, right? They change almost on a daily basis for an organization these days, as we've seen with like Log4j. Um, if and that's the other thing too, like, right, like a vulnerability can become like a priority threat to an organization. That's something to think about too. It isn't just about like adversaries in Russia or China, or other nation states, right? So being able to quickly ingest that intel, and then you skip a lot of the planning phase, right? Because you're at that point, you're not really concerned about red team objectives. You're like, this is the intel, this is what we need to be driven by, and you go right into execution. So you essentially get rid of like a whole phase in this process, and you're able to rapidly execute these things based on intel. And that helps immensely these days, especially to push your organization further in maturity and efficiency, right? Because they get used to being driven by intel, and if that's constantly changing, then at some point, our process, if it's inefficient, it will fail, right? At some point. So with the fails, somebody's going to take a look at it, and they're going to make it more efficient, because they're going to have to keep up with the cadence, the speed of threat intel. Which personally, that's my goal. Start doing it, break things along the way, feel really silly about, like outdated or old school processes, the way that we do things in cybersecurity, just in general. Root cause analysis on those things, solve the problem while we're executing through. Yeah, sure, our process failed, but we executed, we found the failure. Guess what? We're looping right back to the intel, because it's already starting to come in again, and now we got to execute and go break another process. Somebody's fixing that first one, and we're already working on going through and potentially maybe breaking another thing or highlighting another gap. So we have, you start to identify all these gaps, all these broken processes, and then
yeah.
So
it kind of
I don't know, maybe I'm a little crazy.
No, it sounds. I agree, because it sounds like you're taking a much more holistic approach to risk management in your organization. It's there's a description out there where you have intent, capability, opportunity, right? And basically what you're describing is, can you ingest this threat intelligence and determine those three things? Who would actually attack us from the intent side? What capability do they have, and what capability exists, and what opportunities exist? And something like Log4j, something that's actively being exploited, I mean, pretty much across the board, pins out your intent, capability, opportunity, risk meters in all three categories, and it becomes something that's extremely important to everybody very quickly. But there's other stuff, right? Like the NSO exploit that I was reading about, which is just next levels of ridiculous in terms of intent. They're not going to be burning that on exploiting every single cell phone on the planet. Just doesn't make sense. The capability is there, right? And the opportunity is there. They can do it. Those are extremely high, but you're never going to detect that. And the intent is low. So what is the actual risk profile of that being used to target someone in your organization? Could be very high, but probably not.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think a lot of organizations like fail to go through that process. So, you have a lot of red teams taking it way beyond what they need to make it through the environment. Internal red teams, they tend to be ambitious, highly intelligent, and just itching for some, shells, right?
Dunking on the blue team.
Yeah. And even with a good relationship with the blue team, I just think like, most offensive teams are just driven like that. And that's how they're used to operating, but really kind of have to like pull them out of the purple team process in some regards, especially if you're looking at purple team as its own separate team. If you can get that red team person on there and that blue team person on there, and then like Intel, and like you kind of build purple team as a separate team, but with those each of those capabilities within that purple team, you end up faring out because you have blue team experience, you have the Intel experience, you have the red team experience, so you can get all three of those people in the same room, and then you come out with something it's more applicable, it's more realistic, it's more Intel driven, and it's really providing impact. It's providing impact, right, to the organization in a positive way, and it's causing a lot of people and teams to refocus instead of being like, oh man, we really need to worry about this crazy iOS exploit or something tragic going on out there. We should focus on ransomware, for example, and its impact and opportunity to get into our environment and things like that. And then that's how you drive it.
Yeah.
I should be a CISO. I don't want to brag. No, I'm just kidding.
No, you bring up a great point. I've had this conversation with many people. So I think a little bit of my background, but I worked in an air operations center where you're doing operational level planning, and during your exercises, your OPFOR, your red team, is very different from what the commercial sector considers a red team. And it's more of what you're describing. It's like almost exactly what you're describing. Your red team is a part of the exercise, is going to, an external organization is going to come in and lead the red team. And they're going to go to every single person in your, like every team in your organization. They're going to grab one person. And that one person is now going to become part of the OPFOR. And as that OPFOR, they are going to plan the best way to really crank up the heat on your organization and make it hard. And that's how you really figure out what your centers of gravity are and what matters to your company. Because an external red team only knows so much and can only glean so much from reading wikis and not actually exposing themselves to the teams. But building those coalitions inside your organization, and honestly, like if you want a great way to get people to buy into your program, hey, I'm going to do an exercise, tabletop war game, and I want to use people from your team, one person from each of your team, to come up with creative ways to break things in this company. What's more fun than that? Who wouldn't jump at that opportunity? But then you get the buy-in, and you also discover gaps you might not have known about. So you do that from the red side and the OPFOR side, and that sounds more like what you're describing. It sounds more of that collective approach and holistic approach of understanding what your company's threat profile is.
I think if you want to be successful and you want to be successful, like really long term, for decades to come, then you have to do it that way. I'm very fortunate enough to be able to do it that way currently, which is great, right? A lot of places aren't, but that's what they should strive for. In my opinion, get rid of the red tape, innovate, and understand your business. That's a big part of it. Beyond just what your business does day to day, start to understand the impact of things that happen inside of your business, even if it's not like cybersecurity related, right? And those will really help kind of flip the switch on your mindset and get you kind of business driven as well, which is super important too. And that takes a lot of time and effort, and it takes like relationship building. It's terribly difficult in a large organization to understand how it all operates, especially if you have, especially if your company, for instance, like, purchases other companies, to kind of umbrella underneath to provide another service or something like that, or they work with third-party vendors at scale, so like hundreds or thousands of them. It's important that you understand how all that works, because those third parties become a risk to your business at some point. What does that look like? What is the risk? How does that all operate? And then you try to, at least for me, try to find opportunities where you can like innovate like cybersecurity in those spaces quite a bit. So I really try to focus on innovation personally. How can we, a lot of people just, they don't know, especially, like on the IT side or the business side, like they don't they don't know much about cybersecurity in a lot of places, in most places, I would say even. So you got to get them spun up. You got to do it quickly. You got to do it rapidly. It's got to be easily digestible for those teams and those people. And then you have to get to know their processes and their parts of the organization. And then you have to kind of like pull yourself away from it and look from the outside in, and really see like what's broke and where Purple Team can help innovate them to be more secure, right? And get in there.
So what would you recommend to a company that listens to this podcast, or a person that's in a position kind of like you were in, to get started? What would you recommend as the starting point for that team or that person or that organization to begin to make a difference?
Take a look at what you're missing. If you have a blue team, right? Like just straight up ask them, what do you need? What's broken? And then take that back, in your realm, and figure out how you can help them fix that using Purple Team. And like innovate your way through all this, because there's just so many variables at different organizations. It's hard to give like a really specific answer, right? Because someone could do, like if I put out a Purple Teaming framework right now, someone could take that and try to implement that in their organization, and it'll fail because it just doesn't work. They might have more red tape, or they might have less, or they might not have the buy-in and things like that. So it might not work, right? So taking a look, I'll tell you, people love problem solvers, and I like solving problems myself, but people that have problems like people to come in and look at it, especially people that are like external, right? So if I'm looking at the blue team and I see a problem with their response processes, well, how can I help them? And I'm going to take that back with me, and I'm going to try to figure out how to solve that problem using Purple Team, right? So what kind of testing do we need? Do we need to focus our testing efforts? Do we need to develop a specific way we do these testing efforts? Do we need to get on like a specific cadence? Do we do bi-weekly, quarterly, yearly, whatnot? But I would say take a look at like your organization around you, figure out what's making it tick, and where you can innovate. I guess is like the best advice. I mean, it sounds like Silicon Valley advice, but I'm just finding that it works. Like it just works. Like don't ask questions, but like I guess maybe this has to do with a lot of like my Marine Corps experience, but I'm just used to operating like small unit, wise, very, very small unit based. So discover a problem. Don't ask if you can, just do it because you're confident in your own abilities, and then present the solution. Like don't try to implement, like an endpoint security product in your environment, but like try to figure out how to solve that problem, and then have the solution ready to go, and then present that solution, and then get the buy-in, right? So yeah, and that's true for even Purple Teaming, right? So build up your idea on how you're going to solve all these problems with Purple Teaming, and then pitch your solution. Like get leadership's ear and pitch the solution, and get your buy-in. Get like visible thumbs up if you need to, like high fives and stuff like that. But like me personally, I wait for like one, all right, this is good, and then like I'm off. Like I take off like a rocket, and I'm just to outer space, and like that's it. You said good to go. I just need one of you to keep pushing this forward. I don't need 6 people to tell me, okay, this is awesome. I need one, and then like it's movement time. It's time to get going. And really when we look at the realm of cybersecurity, a lot of organizations are like maybe a decade behind the curve, and the curve is only getting more complex as the years go on, right? So it's a lot of catch up in the game right now. I think still, even for mature organizations, they're still behind. It's about catching up if we want to get in front the adversary and the threats, then we have to move at the speed that we're implementing technology and the speed at which threat intelligence is moving. If we can't do that, we'll never be done, putting out fires. We'll never be ahead of the curve at all.
So I think we're running up on time here, Robin. I want to thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, and we got to do this again. Like, this was a great conversation, and so much more that we could talk about.
Oh yeah, definitely. Thank you guys for having me on this. This was super fun.
So this concludes this 0verture podcast. We still have one more podcast to go for the month of December, so keep an eye on that. If you haven't downloaded Operator yet, now's a great time to do so. You can download Prelude Operator at prelude.org. This podcast is distributed on all major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcast and Spotify. And with that, Prelude signing out.